and sustainability. So please stick around. We will be right back. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today we have Matt Alt with us, and we are talking about Japan's pop culture and its influence abroad. Thank you so much for joining, Matt.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
This is so fun. And we actually grew up kind of in a similar area. You're from Washington, D.C., right?
Yeah, the DC area. I grew up in Maryland, which was not exactly a hotbed of Japanese pop culture in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up. How
No.
about you?
Well, I grew up in Hawaii, so of course we had a lot of
Uh,
pop culture when I was little. And then for high school, I moved to Virginia for a few years. So not too far from where you were.
well, I was extremely lucky in that I went to the school that I went to. It's called Walt Whitman High School in Bethesda, Maryland. Had what was, I believe, America's pilot Japanese program at a public school in the United States, in the continuous United States, I guess. I think there might have been some in Hawaii, but in our area certainly it was the only Japanese program, and that was a huge, huge, huge boost for me as somebody who was kind of on the early cutting edge of getting into anime and like Godzilla movies and all sorts of Japanese pop culture.
Yeah, I'm showing your profile pages right now.
Oh,
Uh,
nice.
People can find out more about you, mattalt.com, very easy.
Thank you.
And then also on Instagram. So you've done a lot of writing, you've done books. We're not going to talk about the yokai series or ninja series, but do you want to briefly introduce them?
Don't talk about yokai online.
No,
No,
we
the
want to. We want to, but we don't have enough time. We might have time
no, I
towards the end.
understand.
Yeah.
Well, so a little bit about myself and about what I do here. I co-founded and co-operate a company called Alt Japan that I run with my wife and partner Hiroko Yoda, and we have been working together in the field of localization. Which is basically a fancy word for translation for over 20 years now. And we specialize in mainly pop cultural stuff, video games, manga, books. We help toy companies with their packaging and with their catalogs and things like that. So we've been kind of immersed in the Japanese pop cultural machine, if you want to call it that, for many years now. And it's been a really, really interesting experience, but it's also led us to kind of want to try to strike out on our own. So starting about 10 or 15 years ago, Hiroko and I started writing our own stuff. And our one of our big initial projects was Yokai Attack, the Japanese monster survival guide, which we did for Kodansha International and is now being published by Tuttle. And that was a kind of tongue-in-cheek guidebook introduction to monsters from Japanese folklore, like Kappa and Tengu and things like that. And this my current book, which is called Pure Invention, is my kind of solo debut, if you want to call it that. But it's still kind of linked into that whole world of Japanese pop culture and media and soft power, as it's known, and all of that kind of thing.
And you do speaking engagements as well. I'm showing a picture now of you doing a speaking event. It looks like in a bookstore or something in Japan.
That could be. Yeah, I'm often called on to do kind of commentary and stuff like that. If you found that picture on the mattalt.com website, it's probably me addressing the Tokyo Book Fair. I was asked to give a presentation about kawaii mascots being used especially by the Japanese military, which was it created I wrote a piece on it for the New Yorker about 5 or 6 years back, and it really caused a kind of stir not only among the readers there, but people in Japan who hadn't even noticed that cute imagery was being used. Not, we're not talking like, in the West, people would put cartoon girls or whatever on the noses of their bomber planes or whatever in World War II. We're actually talking about mascot characters that kind of represent the different armed forces in Japan. And so that's probably me lecturing about that. I also was the co-host of a show called Japanology Plus on NHK World for quite a few years with the esteemed Peter Barracon, who is still doing the show. I stepped away to kind of focus on my writing work, but that was always a really, really fun thing to do. They sent me all over Japan on all sorts of wacky missions to cover all sorts of things from craftsmen, craftswomen, pop culture, you name it, throwing me out of helicopters, climbing bridges. Uh,
I saw you eating wasp larva.
Yes, surprisingly good, I got to tell you. Yeah, that was one of my final episodes. We joined an elderly gentleman in Nagano, and he is an expert in tracking down hornets to their nests and then digging out the larvae and eating them, which is a traditional cuisine in the mountains of Nagano. Chinmi, as the Japanese call it, a kind of rare flavor, which is a kind of keyword they use for stuff that's kind of like weird looking or difficult to eat or very, strongly flavored. But it's not strongly flavored. You cook the larva in a kind of sweet sauce and eat it over rice. And I have a feeling if I didn't tell you what you were eating and you didn't look, because there are little heads and legs on there, you probably wouldn't even know what it was. So that was really a fun experience. I'm gonna try anything once kind of guy.
Is that a way to control the wasp population? Like, is that a sustainability thing?
I think it's more, well, it's certainly sustainability in the sense that it is, a kind of hunting gathering sort of way of getting food. I don't think it was intended to control so much as, protein is limited, I think, in the mountains, especially back in time when you can't just drive down to like a convenience store or a supermarket. And, insects are nutritious. They really are, and to be brutally honest, is there that much difference between eating a deep fried hornet and a deep fried, shrimp? We're all talking arthropods here. So it's really a question of overcoming that hurdle. And really, I think it's just a kind of traditional cuisine in a place where maybe they didn't have a lot of, protein sources back in time.
And then, to be honest, there's actually a lot of bugs in our food. We
Yeah,
have,
probably.
what is it? Peanut butter in order to
Oh,
pass.
no.
It
I
has.
just had peanut butter for breakfast.
I eat it all the time, but
Yeah.
apparently you have a pass rate. You can have up to 20% of the peanut butter with insects and it'll still pass.
Oh, 20%. Great. Well, it's extra protein,
I don't know if that's true, but I heard that somewhere and I was like, whoa, that's
Makes you wonder about
crazy.
other foods. I mean,
Yeah.
really, as long as you're not eating some kind of horrific bacteria, probably your
Right.
body is
Yeah, they say it's
able to deal
the
with.
food, the protein of the future. It's everywhere,
Exactly.
right? Now,
Exactly. Maybe, yes.
this reminds me of, do murder hornets really exist, that you wrote for the New Yorker? Was that connected to your visit?
No, it was not. But the visit, which came first, certainly helped inform the writing of that. So, probably like yourself and a lot of people in Japan, you might have been a little bit shocked when this meme gripped the Western world about murder hornets. And for those who might have forgotten in the news cycles upon news cycles that we are experiencing right now, this happened around March or April when it was discovered by an entomologist on the west coast of America that Japanese giant hornets had been discovered in the kind of Pacific Northwest corridor. And despite the fact that the entomologist only discovered indirect evidence of them, in that giant hornets traditionally prey on honeybee hives, and they found a couple of ransacked honeybee hives. This kind of blew up into hornets are invading the United States, and it was inflamed by the fact that the article in the New York Times that wrote about it quoted a Japanese entomologist who used the phrase murder hornet to describe them. And, I quickly realized that must have been a mistranslation or a mischaracterization. There's a phrase in Japanese, satsujinbachi, which is the Japanese translation of an English phrase that means killer bee, which was a big meme of sorts in the West in the 1970s. So this would get layers upon layers here. But murder hornets somehow struck a kind of weird nerve with people who I guess were already getting tired of constant coronavirus coverage. Like, how much worse can it get? Now murder hornets are coming after us.
I know. I saw it on Stephen Colbert, and I was like, "What are they talking about?" I mean, we have those in Japan. I interviewed some bee farmers, right? Like honeybee farmers, and they were saying we have to kill the susumebachi because they eat the honeybees. So we feel sad. They're part of nature, but they will destroy our honeybees.
And they can be dangerous. I mean, a good friend of mine, actually the gentleman who edited Yokai Attack when it first came out, was gardening and accidentally disturbed a nest of not giant hornets, but Japanese hornets that were kind of under a leaf when he's like kind of weeding, and they all came out, and his hand looked like it had been inflated like a balloon, you know?
Yeah.
So you can imagine, especially if you're immunocompromised or elderly and you get attacked by a big swarm, it could be really bad. So they actually are dangerous. Like
Oh yeah.
the point isn't to say that, but murder, I was
Yeah.
like, wait a second, do these guys have it
Are
in
they
for us?
plotting? Yeah.
But it was really the whole murder hornet escapade, so to speak, was really interesting to me because I really believe that it was also fueled by the fact that they were Japanese.
Yeah.
And again, you see this where something quote unquote weird or strange from Japan sort of grips the outside world,
Yeah.
and kind of takes off flying on its own in ways that the Japanese not only didn't launch it, but they can't control it and can barely comprehend it.
Yeah.
If you explained this murder hornet thing back to Japanese people, they'd be like, what? We've been living with these things since time immemorial. What?
Yeah.
Like, why is this a meme now?
Yeah.
But to me, it's another facet of the West's fascination with all sorts of things Japanese. And, I think if they had been Chinese murder hornets or Romanian murder hornets, or, you know what I'm saying? Or like British murder hornets, it never would have taken off in the same way, because Japan has this, resonation with all sorts of pocket-sized monsters and giant monsters and yokai and other things that really don't neatly contextualize into the way the West sees the world. And that's Japan's strength, I think, as a kind of, you might even call it a fantasy superpower.
Yeah. Which leads right into talking about your book.
Wait a second. On that note.
But before we start that, I just wanted to mention this one. You did a chapter in another book. You're talking about retelling soft power, and it really struck me how you're talking about things from Japan, and this leads into your book as well.
Sure.
Things from Japan getting digested and changed abroad, and then back to Japan, and then changing Japanese culture. And so I think that was one of the most powerful statements of your Pure Invention book, is that it's not only pop culture from Japan affecting abroad, it actually comes back and affects Japan again, right?
Well, sure. I mean, with globalization, everybody's connected these days in ways good and bad. Without globalization, we wouldn't see a global pandemic. That's the bad side of it. On the other hand, we're connected in ways that are really wonderful too, cultural exchanges and things like that. So the interesting thing to me in the writing of Pure Invention, I knew that things from Japan had a kind of outsized cultural pull because I had felt it for so long. As a kid, I grew up playing with Transformers and Voltron and, playing Super Mario Brothers while my, sister collected Hello Kitty gear, or watched Sailor Moon, or, all sorts of things were filtering in from Japan. At the same time, our parents were like grumbling about Japanese cars and Japanese electronics. The president of the United States is like putting all sorts of taxes and, tariffs and things on, Japan is this, to the grown-ups, Japan was this big enemy, like a culture, economic enemy at any rate, and 70 years before that, it had been a real enemy, like an actual military enemy. But to us, especially starting with Gen Xers, Japan never had the image of a kind of terrorizing other. It was the country that made all of this cool stuff that we really wanted, like Walkmans and like, the karaoke machine, like all sorts of fun ways of new ways of experiencing our leisure time, and by extension, our lives. So, I had always been interested in trying to quantify that, but it's really tough, right? It's like, I didn't want to write a book that was just like, hey man, this stuff's really cool, because that's just like your opinion, man. It's like, I wanted to kind of get more in depth with it. And that the result of it was Pure Invention. But the key insight was that these products succeeded not just because they're great products, but because all of us around the world, especially in the West, are coming to resemble the Japanese in so many ways, socially, demographically, economically. The reason that we love this stuff from Japan so much is it provides answers to questions that we hadn't asked yet about our own society and lives. So that was kind of the driving idea behind the book. And the reason why, I was able to treat things like Hello Kitty or the karaoke machine as more than just, curiosities, because I really do see them as tools, as new ways of looking at the world.
Yeah. I'd
Yeah.
like to start talking about the toys, the
Oh,
World
please.
War II toys. That was, in terms of my passion for sustainability, there were so many takeaways from that story.
Yes.
Can you introduce that part of the book?
Yeah, so just a little bit of background here. Toys are more than just toys. Like they have always been key to the way that Japan has interacted with the world. Like back in the late Victorian era, the late 1800s and the early 1900s, toys were among Japan's top export, and they were actually poised to become the top exporter of toys to the entire world right when World War II broke out. And of course, that like just completely destroyed the Japanese toy market because it completely destroyed Japan. And the very first chapter of Pure Invention deals with a really interesting story about a man named Matsuzo Kosuge, who was one of Japan's top tin toy makers before World War II. He's born in 1899, so he's already a middle-aged gentleman by the time war breaks out. But he had been forced to make military components for most of the war because nobody's allowed to make toys during the war. But the minute the war ended, he got right back into the toy business. The problem was there was no material around. There was nothing to make toys out of. Like all of Japan's cities had been leveled. So what he did was he had the divine inspiration to go to the American military bases and negotiate with them to take their trash away and get the tin cans out of it, which he cleaned off and with his people, flattened and formed over molds. And he created this little tiny tin toy car of an American Jeep. And he put it on sale. He convinced a Kyoto department store, in fact, Japan's only department store still standing at that time, to put it on sale. December of 1945. December of 1945, like the war had only ended a couple months earlier. He sold hundreds and hundreds and thousands of these things to Japanese people. And it was really not only the first luxury that was sold after the war's end, it seems to have been the first manufactured product of any kind sold after war's end. I mean, of course, there were things that had been manufactured before the war they'd gotten from the American. Of course, that stuff was on the marketplace. But I'm talking about stuff that was made in Japan. This is made in Japan post-war item number one. And I think it's really telling, number one, that it's a toy, it's a plaything. And number two, that it's recycled. It's recycled it is literal trash into treasure. And that little Jeep not only brightened the lives of so many people, kids and adults in Japan, it kickstarted the entire Japanese toy industry, which in turn, several years later, kickstarted the Japanese economy. So it's this really it's a forgotten story. I don't think even many Japanese people realize this, but toys really did save Japan in a lot of ways. And I'm biased. I love Japanese toys. So of course I'm going to look at Japan through the lens of toys. But I thought this was a really interesting anecdote to begin
It's
the book with.
fascinating. Yeah, and he was sparked by the idea as he's walking out of a hot spring and he measures a real Jeep with his towel. I love
Yes.
I love
Yeah.
that anecdote. That's
Yes.
amazing.
Well, as a tin toy maker in the years leading up to the war, he would get catalogs from Ford or Chevy or Studebaker, whoever he was making, or at least photographs.
Hmm.
But this is a military vehicle. It's a Jeep. It's a Willys Jeep, and it's the classic World War II Jeep. Of course, there's no catalog for it. Certainly not in the enemy country of Japan. So to get the dimensions right, because this is key, like Kosuge was a shokunin. He was a Japanese craftsperson. So even though he's making this thing out of junk, even though it's a toy, he wants it to be just right. So he actually measures it quietly with the only thing he has, which is a furoshiki, like a bath towel. And he uses the bath towel and takes the dimensions of the thing, runs home, scribbles them down. I guess it's like 3 furoshiki this way and like 2 this. I don't know exactly how he did it, but it's documented that that's exactly what he did, used a towel. And lo and behold, he makes this quite beautiful little rendition of a vehicle that is so loaded with baggage, cultural baggage. It's the chariot of the conquerors. It is like the symbol of Japan's defeat. Yet Japanese children are just filled with longing for this thing. Not just the toy, but the Jeeps themselves. Like, because to kids who don't understand the politics or the broader cultural issues, all of a sudden these big, strapping American men riding around in these thrilling vehicles, and they're not only that, they're not just riding around, they're treating the kids really well. They're giving them candy, they're giving them gum. So the kids, every time they saw a Jeep, it was potentially like Christmas, in July. It's like, hey, the Americans are coming with more goodies for us. So it was this really, that Jeep is there. There's a lot to unpack there. Adults were consuming it because they saw, the Jeep as a kind of symbol of not only surrender and loss, but also, where Japan might go in the future. Because Japan has always been a country that's been really comfortable admitting its shortcomings and trying to compensate for them by incorporating stuff from abroad. So yeah, I mean,
It's an
the Jeeps are
amazing story. And in terms of sustainability at the time, we're talking about so many key points here, right? Like he's using innovation and know-how from something he already knew how to do. He had
yes,
to give up all of his presses of making cars, which he
yes,
was doing before, which was very popular. He used local housewives to help
yeah,
with the process, which I'm showing a picture of now. He upcycled waste material to have the material for his product. He had to improvise and be flexible. Now, this is a lovely point that frustrates me about Japan in many ways, right? Is the unwillingness to be flexible and pivot
yes,
when things are needed. So he used rubber bands instead of springs. This is all in your book. So
yes.
it's just an amazing, beautiful example of sustainability, creating innovation, creating economic income for the country and for himself, creating jobs. There's so
And
many great things here.
resilience,
Yes,
resilience. I think.
yes.
I think when people talk about Japan being rigid, and this was another kind of key thing that I took away from the book. It's easy to generalize things about societies that aren't true about individuals.
Yeah.
Kosuge was obviously not a rigid thinking person. He
No,
was
not at
somebody who
all.
definitely thought out of the box. And
Yeah.
again and again with the stories that I tell in Pure Invention about the creators of these objects that transformed our lives, you are continually seeing people who think outside of the box, who are racked with doubt, but kind of carry on anyway, even in the face of, maybe this isn't going to be successful. Most of the products in the book, nobody believed was going to be a success. And like looking back now, um, you're like, that's crazy. Somebody thought the Walkman wasn't going to be a success. Sony did not think the Walkman was going to be a success.
Yeah.
Nintendo did not think the Famicom, the NES, was going to be a success. The karaoke machine was some guy invented it in his garage and tried selling it for years before it took off. So there's this kind of persistence. I'm sure there's a lot of like imposter syndrome, going on that had to be overcome to make these things. And that was really key to me to kind of tell those human dramas behind this, because that is even more important than how many Jeeps
Yeah.
sold or how many Nintendos sold or
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
And I love this quote from your book when you talk about taking a leap of faith that he had, right? So in 1922, he launched his own toy manufacturing. So this is even before his upcycled product later.
Yes.
He worked on his passion to build toys
Yes.
without salary for a year. Like he
Yes.
really did a leap of faith to start his
Yes.
own business.
Yes. We don't know exactly the details of how he went into business, but it must have been when he was around 23 or 24, and he was just that driven. I mean, Kosuke was certainly a visionary, and a lot of the people in the book are visionary, but I think it's also really key to remember that even visionaries don't really know how things are going to turn out. If they
No.
did, they would be ESP, they'd be using their ESP to, get it really ahead of the game.
Yeah.
We're all kind of blindly groping our way through the times that we live in. And it's only in hindsight that everything really clarifies. So, that was another kind of key insight that I took from this, is that nobody knows what's going on. Nobody. Like Sanrio, they have no clue why Hello Kitty does well, even today, but they roll with it,
Yeah.
and that's really important.
Well, let's talk about Sanrio and
Yes.
kawaii culture. That's another big chapter of your book. You want to introduce it?
Well,
I
kawaii
Yeah.
is the Japanese word for cute, but it doesn't really neatly overlap with that definition of the word in English, because cute, and this is something I learned in the writing of this, cute is actually a kind of a double-edged sword in English. It comes from the word acute, as in like sharp or pointy, and it up until quite recently was actually used also as an insult, like don't be cute, like kind of a watch your mouth sort of thing. So, but in Japan, kawaii doesn't have any of that baggage with it at all. It's just pure innocence, fluffiness, bunny rabbits and rainbows, like this sort of thing, kitty cats. And Sanrio was really the first company to distill it down into an essence and market it as a product in and of itself. And the essence they distilled it into was Hello Kitty, which is really a pretty simple looking doodle when you break her down, simplicity is very difficult to nail. So I am not saying that, Yuko Shimizu, who is the 20 something artist who drew Hello Kitty in 1974, I mean, hats off to her. It's an amazing, iconic design, but it's, I don't think anybody, least of all Ms. Shimizu, would have imagined this cat would change the world.
Yeah. Well, in the book, you talk about how what is his name? Not Negishi.
The Tsuji-san,
Tsuji-san,
the president
and
of
how
Sanrio, yeah.
he started designing some of the products himself to make super
Yes.
cute. And he had lots of success with the strawberry design, but then zero success with cherries.
Yes. So Tsuji was a guy who was kind of in touch with his feminine side. Like he was a guy, like a middle-aged guy who would have no problem running around saying kawaii himself, which is pretty unusual for a man back in the 1960s.
Well, you talk about his bedroom.
Yes, his bed. That was amazing. So in a 1970s business book about him, it is his right-hand man recalls being invited over to Tsuji's house for a business meeting, going to use the bathroom and seeing Tsuji's bedroom, and it's like full of Hello Kitty stuff. It's like this girly, like, romper room kind of thing. And I just love the idea that this guy's like salaryman by day, and then like at night, rips the tie off and is like in his Hello Kitty outfit or whatever. I just thought that was so great. And, if anybody deserves to, revel in his kawaii-ness, it's certainly the founder of Sanrio. But
for sure, and it shows the complexity of kawaii.
Yes,
that it's not just girly. It's not just for little girls. It's not even just for women. It's very complicated.
Yeah, well, it's getting in touch with your kind of girly side. And I think Sanrio, more than anybody, made it clear that all of us can get in touch with our girly sides. Do you know what I mean? And that's not weakness. It's actually power. It's like another way of looking at the world. It's another way of navigating the world. Yeah. And that's why I think kawaii culture, and kitty in particular, proved to be this kind of rallying point, this symbol for young women in the 1990s. Who came to be called by the Japanese media kogals. And there's a lot of coverage of these teenage women on the streets of Shibuya who were rebelling against, society by simply not having, wanting to settle down and get married, by not wanting to follow traditional gender roles. But what they were doing was forging relationships with each other, new ways of relating with each other. And the way they did that was by harnessing every bit of culture and technology available to them at the time, which ironically made Japanese schoolgirls, literally for the 1990s, they were the early adopters and the cutting edge technophiles of the planet. And that story is told in the later chapter of Pure Invention. Was really eye-opening to me to realize that really, like the roots, the foundations of social media were not invented in Silicon Valley. They were invented by schoolgirls in Shibuya and other Japanese urban centers rallying under this Jolly Roger of Hello Kitty. And that's an amazing scene to me. Even as a guy, I think this is just so cool. We all follow in their footsteps.
Yeah, it's amazing. You put on Instagram and Twitter the other day about the original Hello Kitty purse. And I swear I had one of these when I was a little girl in Hawaii. I am so sad I did not hold on to it.
I'm sad too. You'd be able to retire. You wouldn't be doing this podcast though if you did. You'd be living in a mansion somewhere.
Oh my gosh.
It just goes to show you how ephemeral this stuff is. Nobody knew what Kosuge's Jeep even looked like until about 15 years ago when a museum in Otsu went and tracked it down and found it. Hello Kitty's purse, this is like the seminal expression of this iconic character. Even Sanrio didn't have one. They finally tracked one down in the 1990s. One. That's the only one that's ever turned up. And it just goes to show you how, just because something is epically world changing, it doesn't mean that it's kind of eternal, that it's going to be with us all the time. And the kind of how much things are constantly in flux and changing. So yeah, I really want to, like, I imagine like somebody someday doing a Mission Impossible style like descent into the vault to get the Hello Kitty purse. You know,
I wonder
even
if they're in some like time capsules at schools and stuff that they
yeah,
haven't
you
opened
wonder.
yet, right?
You wonder. I mean, there are, and it's important to say, if people do see them laying around, they were reissued in the late 1990s, and so you know, there are replicas of them out there. But yeah, the originals, nobody's been able to find even a second one. So if you find one, give me a call.
Yeah. Another thing from the Kawaii chapter is also indicative of you as a translator and how you've been working with the game, anime, manga industry, going back and forth, trying to make Japanese culture more accessible to international markets. And how in your book you talk about realizing the customers abroad actually wanted it to be more Japanese.
Yeah, it's interesting. I call it kind of the great synchronization. It's this synchronization of tastes globally, a kind of another way of putting what we call a Japanization of global tastes. And when I say this, a lot of people are like, "What? What? I'm not Japanese. My tastes aren't Japanese." But when you start unraveling it, you realize, yes, they actually are. And what happened was, in when we first started working as localizers, there was often a huge lag time between the things that came out in Japan and when they came out in the West. Many months were spent localizing them, and nobody was really watching the Japanese marketplace. But as years went on, that cycle shortened dramatically, and the customers started demanding that the stuff be released instantaneously along with the Japanese releases. And at first I thought, wow, I guess there's more otaku out there than I realized. And then then it hit me. It isn't that at all. It isn't about otaku or obsessive people. It's that our tastes, because we have been consuming so much Japanese pop culture, starting with the 1980s and leading up to now, there's an entire generation of people who are raised on the Nintendo Entertainment System and various game systems, on manga, on anime on the Cartoon Network, singing on karaoke machines and listening to Japanese portable music devices. And as we consumed these things, they transformed our tastes. They brought us closer to the taste of the people who they were originally made for. And as our societies have really rapidly come to resemble one another, Japan experienced this massive crash of its bubble popping in 1990 and went into this horrific recession. Well, 2008 with the Lehman shock, that same thing happened abroad. And now all of these trends that we used to see the Western media making fun of Japanese people for. Oh, grown-ups consuming kid culture. Oh, look at this. Girls and boys living at home with their parents and not starting families. Oh, look, retreating into fantasy worlds. Well, over and over again, Japan's story is ours. We see it happening in the West. And that's what I mean when I say that our Japanese sensibilities and culture have really synchronized between Japan and the West. Japan used to be a couple steps ahead in the future, and that's why we love the stuff that it gave us. Now we've kind of really synchronized, and we're all in this together.
Yeah, I'm showing your images from your talk about Andy Warhol wearing the Walkman, Steve
Yeah.
Jobs. You mentioned Steve Jobs, I think in the podcast with Japan Times or
Yes.
99%. Those are
Well,
two great interviews, by the way.
thank you.
How he just took it apart when he was given a Walkman. That's a powerful story.
The iPhone is actually a really great example of this Japanization of taste because, Steve Jobs was obsessed with Sony. He didn't want to be IBM. He didn't want to be Microsoft. He wanted to be Sony. And just like you just said right now, there's an anecdote in the book where when Akio Morita, then Sony's, I believe he was chairman at the time, gave Steve Jobs a Walkman, Jobs took it apart. He didn't, and this is Jobs is a music lover. He didn't even need to listen to it to know how world-changing this was because the Walkman was the first product that made technology cool, actually cool. And that's that image that you just showed of Andy Warhol started walking around New York City with the headphones on, not even plugged into a Walkman. He just wanted to be seen wearing the headphones. Up until that moment, the only people who wore headphones were like air traffic controllers or like hearing impaired people. It was a necessity. It wasn't something that was cool. And suddenly this little company, well, they're not so little, but this company from Japan upends the idea of what cool is with this gadget. Jobs really digested that, and he studied Sony. And without the Walkman, you wouldn't have the iPod. Without the iPod, you wouldn't have the iPhone. And Jobs was so obsessed with Sony that he had to be physically restrained from calling the iMac the Macman. He literally wanted to call it the Macman.
Wow.
Yeah, as like an homage, to the Walkman. And they're like, no, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Good, probably for the best they didn't do that. But it just goes to show you how deeply those Japanese sensibilities affected Jobs. Jobs incorporated them into his products, and then we flocked to those products. So, this kind of this fusion of Japanese and foreign tastes resulting in new and exciting products is, I think, the wave of the future. Pokemon Go is another example of that. Made in Silicon Valley using Japanese characters. 1 billion installs on smartphones around the world. Those are crazy numbers,
That's
So
amazing.
this is this synchronization of taste that I'm talking about, and it's a very real phenomenon.
Yeah. You also talk about the launch of Final Fantasy. And
Were
so
you a
that
fan? Were you a fan? Did you play?
I was, yeah, but like Mario as well. But it's interesting to see also Pac-Man used to be called Puck-Man.
Hmm.
Mario used to be Super Mario Land. It goes back to the thing about the consumer, even abroad, did not want the English version of the name. Even they wanted what Japan had, right? That was
Yeah, yeah, the in the case of Mario was originally called, I think, Jumpman. That was his original name in Donkey Kong, and then he was actually renamed by Nintendo of America. But it's interesting because to me, Mario is an example of a kind of culturally odorless, as they say, character. It's and Hello Kitty too, and Mario and Kitty actually have a lot in common design-wise. They're not, they are Japanese in that Japanese people created them, but you don't need any particular grounding in Japanese culture to appreciate them. Mario's world is this sort of, synthetic Western Japanese wonderland. It has kind of Western Japanese design sensibilities in it, but it's based on a kind of, almost Anderson fairy tale style, go to the castle, rescue the princess from the dragon type of situation that is instantly familiar to people abroad. And, it was made for people in Japan who appreciated, who saw Western culture as something exotic and aspirational. And the irony is that when that came back to the West, it seemed so fresh and new that it became exotic and aspirational to the people who were consuming it. So that's a really interesting, dynamic that's at play with almost every invention that I talk about at Pure Invention, where it's made for people in Japan for their own purposes, but then repurposed abroad, often in ways the Japanese had no expectation of. So, we're getting back to this whole thing. Nobody really knows what's going on. It's so
yeah.
difficult to predict how
It is.
fads are going to play out.
It is. And I was really struck by something you said in the Japan Times podcast that you don't believe in cool Japan.
No,
You don't think pop culture can be exported in a meticulous way, that it's
I
more of its own animal.
well, I would you can even put it a different way. I think that the reason things from Japan seem so cool abroad is because you kind of have to stumble upon them and find them. Anime is a great example of this. It's like there's no like rules or guidebook or anything to anime. You kind of just you stumble across one when you're a certain age, and that leads to another one and another one, and before you know it, you've constructed this entire identity for yourself out of things that you found. This isn't a situation where the Japanese government is coming in and saying, we legislate that these are the coolest anime. Probably like 20 years from now, we're actually going to see this, but it never works because there's nothing less cool than authority figures telling you what is. That's why Cool Japan is kind of doomed to failure. That said, there's aspects to that program that are really great. Like there's a translation subsidy, which the government helps fund translations of books and games and all sorts of stuff. That is really smart stuff. That is Cool Japan that works. But actually trying to dictate or legislate or even suggest tastes is a fool's endeavor. People have to forge their own tastes,
Yeah.
because their tastes are so key to their identities.
And I think especially now with social media the way it is, and people can discover things, use Google Translate,
Yeah.
and go beyond language.
Well, we're in a golden age of stumbling across stuff. I mean, that's why it's so hard to get work done these days. You do a Google search and suddenly you're like, oh wow, what is this all about? And you go down some rabbit hole and suddenly it's 8 p.m. and you haven't even gotten close to finishing your stuff for your deadline. I mean, we live in an era of information overload. So I do understand the need for some kind of not gatekeeping necessarily, but curation.
Hmm.
Curation's a good thing, but most of us want to find our own curators. We don't really turn to the government for curation. Whether you're whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, I certainly don't turn to political leaders for what is cool in my life. I turn to them for doing stuff that makes our lives better, in
Yeah.
the sense of infrastructure and things like that.
Yeah.
So the idea of government stepping in and trying to, and it's more, the Japanese aren't dictate. The Japanese, even at its worst, the Cool Japan program isn't trying to dictate what's cool. This isn't some kind of, repressive pop cultural dictatorship, but just even simply talking about it is uncool, you know?
Well, let's shift gears a little bit to karaoke. Let's talk
Sure.
about karaoke a little bit from the book.
Well, let's. It's
Yeah.
no, I mean karaoke is interesting. So I always have to. I should preface this by saying, living in Japan for so long, I say karaoke,
Mm.
but I've been training myself to say karaoke because
Yeah.
that's how people say it abroad. I mean,
Well,
look
the
at
name
yeah.
itself is very interesting because in the book you talk about how the original reaction to the word karaoke in Japan was not good.
Yeah, the gentleman Negishi-san who invented the first karaoke machine tried marketing it with he teamed up with another company to market it, and they're like, we can't call it karaoke. It sounds like kangoke, which is coffin in Japanese. I think this was just this one guy's hang up. Negishi-san, when I was talking, he's like, I don't know, man, it's karaoke. It's karaoke now, But there was somebody out there who had an issue with it. But look at it now. Like we use the word karaoke all over the world to refer to the act of singing on a microphone to pre-recorded music. There's nothing particularly Japanese pop culture about that, Like any country could have come up with the idea of hooking a microphone up to a tape deck with instrumental music and singing over it. It's not like Japan doesn't have a monopoly on singing or on tape decks, certainly. Yet the karaoke machine was independently invented 5 times in Japan between 1967 and 1971. That is wild to me. Why 5 times? It wasn't even just some lone, wonderfully nutty inventor coming up with it. It was 5 different people coming up with it. So there was something in the air at the time, and what was in the air at the time was salaryman culture. They needed ways to entertain themselves. So that karaoke chapter turned into this exploration of Japanese salaryman lifestyle, especially in the 60s and 70s, which is a very unique ecosystem, so to speak, of its own.
Yeah.
You know, are you?
It was also interesting how there were so many things about Japanese history that I didn't know. Like the guy Negishi-san who started with Sparkle Box,
I know.
um,
Yes, Sparkle Box. Yes, yeah.
that he was talking about it was easy to access instrumental tapes. So that made it a no-brainer for the karaoke, like creating karaoke for
Sure.
getting people to sing. But he also got his hostess friends to go and sing in the bars to make it more popular because at first people really didn't know how to use it. So there
Yeah.
was a lot of like entrepreneurial innovation at work there.
Ingenuity. Yeah. So
Yes.
Negishi-san came up with the idea of a karaoke machine, right? And he was greatly aided by the fact that there were a lot of instrumental tapes in the marketplace, like you said. But he's not widely celebrated as the father of karaoke in Japan. Another guy is Daisuke Inoue. And Inoue is different from Negishi was a tinkerer, he was an engineer. Inoue was a band leader. And this is the key difference here. While Negishi was relying on commercially recorded tapes, Daisuke Inoue in Kobe realized something really key, which is that, drum roll please, the average person is a horrific singer. And even if you strip out the lyrics from a professional song, it's really difficult to sing to it. They're often at very high registers, they're often, or the tempo is difficult to keep up with. We're not professionals. So what Inoue-san did was, for his machine, he provided it with a library of tapes that he and his band had re-recorded of pop songs, subtly retuned, you know, detuned, so to speak, so that normal schmoes could sing them and feel like they were singing like pros. So in a lot of ways, it was like almost like an Instagram filter. It was like a helping hand, that made amateurs feel like pros. And that was the key takeaway of the karaoke machine. It's really the first technological assist for creativity in our lives, and it led to so many other things today, like image stabilization for cameras. Like we take these things for granted in our lives, that all sorts of tech will help us kind of strive to be more professional in what we do. The karaoke machine was actually the progenitor of all of that. It's the forerunner of all of those things.
Well,
So yeah.
it reminded me of you're talking about the Walkman, because the Walkman made music personal.
Yeah.
And the karaoke machine made people professional sounding singers, even as
Yes.
amateurs. So lots of parallels playing back and forth.
Yes. Yes. And it's all about kind of creating your own personal fantasy spheres.
Mm-hmm.
It's so in the book, the products that I deal with, I call them fantasy delivery devices, because they deliver us new ways of experiencing reality around us, often, augmenting the way that we live our lives. So, karaoke helps us sing. The Walkman gives us a portable soundtrack. Hello Kitty, gives us, it helps us kind of connect with one another. Emoji, the same thing. So there's all sorts of, technologies from Japan that really, when you distill them down, they make us happier in a very confusing, difficult to navigate world.
Yeah, you talk in the book about the three ins. Can you explain that? How you
Yeah.
chose the things?
Yeah, so the as I just said, the idea the book chronicles Japan's fantasy delivery devices, which are products that changed the way we looked at the world and looked at Japan. And the way that I picked what was described as a fantasy delivery device was a criteria I called the three ins. It had to be to qualify as a fantasy delivery device. First of all, it had to be inessential, because if it's food, you're going to consume it no matter what. You have to live, or this is why I didn't put cars in there, because America is an automotive society. You're going to buy a car no matter what. They had to be inessential, something that we purchased because we wanted, not because we needed. And then they had to be inescapable. They had to become ubiquitous. They had to be everywhere, like the Walkman was within a year of its launch. You couldn't escape them. And lastly, and most importantly, it had to be influential. It had to influence the way that we looked at the world, or the way that we thought of Japan. And in many cases in the book, both. And if it satisfied the objects in the book, the inventions all satisfy those three criteria. And they really transformed the way that we lived our lives. And the way that they transformed our lives was making our lives more Japanese in a lot of ways. So it all comes back together in one big circle.
Yeah, really
Yeah.
interesting. I think one thing we haven't talked about yet is the kind of launch of animation or manga or tezuka with Atom Boy. Can
Yeah,
you
yeah,
just
yeah.
introduce that part a little bit?
Well, anime is a really fascinating medium, because it has such an insanely broad appeal. It really pulls in people from all walks of life, all political spectrums, and it's very difficult to think of any other medium of entertainment that has this kind of pull. Where everybody from alt-right Trump supporters to democracy activists in Hong Kong are rallying under their own favorite anime. That's really an amazing sort of broad pull. And anime as we know it, which anime simply being the Japanese word for animation, for cartoons, it really started with Osamu Tezuka, a Japanese manga artist who created a character named Mighty Atom, who we know in the West as Astro Boy, and that was the first televised, feature length, half-hour length cartoon broadcast in Japan. It debuted in 1963, and the world was never the same. That really started the entire Japanese television animation industry. And it was that entire chapter is really interesting, watching how illustrated entertainment kind of nourished everyone from kids to student radicals in the 1960s. And you just see that happening again and again and again in the world today, in ways that American comics, which are great, but they don't resonate like that. And unraveling the reasons why was one of the big key, things I wanted to do in the book.
And one of the parts that I really liked from that chapter was how Tezuka ended up, even after he became popular and made a lot of money, he still encouraged other manga artists and really became like a great mentor.
Yes. Yeah. Tezuka is so great because he's so human. He's this neurotic, insecure, big-hearted, extraordinarily talented guy. And with all of the kind of contradictions that it embraces. So like, while he's incredibly jealous of anybody who is encroaching on his popularity, he's also incredibly generous of his time and expertise for everyone to everyone from fellow manga artists to even kids who would come in off the street and want to talk to him on a busy day, and he would make time for them. And one of the great things about the book was seeing all of these connections that I've never seen before. Like, for instance, Mr. Negishi, who invented the karaoke machine, before he invented the karaoke machine, had spent some time making radios and actually worked with Tezuka's company to license Astro Boy and put the sticker on the radio and sell it as like a kind of a character product. And when he went to Tezuka's studio, he saw Tezuka's kind of production system where Tezuka was literally on a top floor, like a loft, and like lowering pages down on a rope to assistants who would ink and then send it back up for coloring. And that left this huge impression on Negishi of how you could kind of automate and like kind of make a business out of your passion. And again, the gentleman who created the Nintendo Entertainment System, he grew up playing with Kosuge's Jeep on the streets of Kyoto. So you see these connections over and over again, these overlapping kind of things in how these creators would unwittingly inspire one another. And that was really inspiring, to see.
That's great. Well, we
Yeah.
only have 8 minutes left.
Okay, let's make them count.
Yeah, let's make them count. Is there anything we haven't touched on from the book that you'd like to talk about?
Wow.
There's a lot there.
There is a lot there. It's, people often ask me a little bit about the process of writing the book. It was very actually rapid, perhaps too rapid. The idea was to bring it out for the Olympics, which, as we all know, didn't happen. So I had to rush to make this deadline. And, I wasn't rushing in my writing or anything like that, but just the process was very compressed into about a year. It was a very tight schedule, and I spent like basically that entire year running around doing interviews and like immersing myself in stacks of texts at the Diet Library downtown and in my local library. God, I love libraries. Without them, this never would have happened. So thank you, libraries. Thank you, librarians. You made my life easier.
Well, you talk about the title a little bit because you got it from Oscar Wilde, right?
Yes, we probably should explain that. It's funny, it barely comes up in the book. But so Pure Invention is a quote from a playwright named Oscar Wilde, who's a really great character and a tragic character in a lot of ways in his own right. But he came of age and was active in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the entire planet, Western world, was in the grip of Japanism, which is this fad for things Japanese, a kind of cool Japan of the 19th century, as it were. And Wilde, that was fueled not by anime and toys, but by woodblock prints and silverware but once again, Japanese products. Westerners would consume these Western products, and they would kind of put their own interpretations on them. And that is what Mr. Wilde was making fun of when he wrote in one of his plays, there is the nation of Japan doesn't exist. It's a nation of pure invention. Actually, wait, I have the quote right here. Shall we read it?
Yeah.
It is the quote. The actual quote is, "In fact, the whole of Japan is pure invention. There is no such country. There are no such people. The Japanese people are, as I have said, simply a mode of style, an exquisite fancy of art." Now, of course, Oscar Wilde knew full well that there was a thriving, vibrant nation of Japanese people out there. What he was making fun of were Europeans who basically invented what Japanese values were in their own head that had nothing to do with actual Japanese people. And for the book, I kind of turned that on its head because, of course, the word invention in English has multiple meanings. Wilde's using it to mean a fantasy. I'm using it to mean a product. And that's why the book deals with fantasy delivery devices, which is how Japan used invention to kind of not only get its way out of the ashes, to rebuild itself from the ashes of war, but to transform itself into this global globally recognized island of dreams for so many people around the world today. And that is a really amazing transformation. I think it's historically unprecedented, really. And I think understanding how that happened is not only a fascinating story in and of itself, but it helps us understand how we got to now. Pure Invention, I wrote Pure Invention not only as a celebration of all this wonderful stuff, but as a sort of roadmap to explain how all of the weirdness of our lives is inflected and influenced in many ways by the things that we consume from Japan.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really great. I wanted to talk about, for the last 5 minutes, if we can,
Yeah.
on the future. And I think you mentioned it in one of the podcasts about current pop culture. Is current Japanese pop culture going to be as influential? Now, in the book, a little bit, you talk about going through the depression and the market crash and how that actually created a lot of interesting pop culture. So now that everybody's going through the coronavirus, there is another
Yes.
depression.
Yes.
Can you predict, or can you see that in 10 years' time or 5 years' time, there might be some creativity happening from this low time?
No,
No.
I can't predict it because what I learned from this book is that nobody can predict the way anything is going to play out. That being said, I think there are some really interesting parallels between exactly what you just said, which is that Japan's most interesting dynamic period of cultural creation, when it emerged as a cultural tastemaker, is precisely at the moment where everybody had written the country off. Japan's bubble popped. Oh, they're not relevant anymore. Well, go figure. That's exactly those 1990s and early 2010s, the lost decades, are precisely when Japan became the most culturally relevant that it's ever been, in its entire history of interactions with the West. So we are experiencing a kind of global and virally driven crash on a very much more macro level than the kind of localized bubble popping was in Japan. And it is my sincere hope and my belief that the only way that we can get out of this kind of post-viral hellhole, post-apocalyptic economic hellhole, is to innovate our way out of it. It's to invent our way out of it. We are going to have to create the new tools, just like Japanese people did, to help them get to the lost decades, because our lost decades are really just starting in a lot of ways. With the huge economic hit the entire global economy is taking. And I'm actually very much looking forward to seeing what happens. I'm optimistic because the Japanese gave us a roadmap. They gave us a kind of example of how you can not only survive but thrive when the world is in many ways falling apart around you. So that is the lesson, I think, that I would love people to take away from this book. That there's always a light at the end of the tunnel, and that creation, innovation, imagination are the ways that we're going to get through it.
Absolutely. And there's so much sustainability in terms of preserving culture,
Yes.
preserving history, resilience,
Yes.
innovation. There's so much of this in your book, which I think is really inspiring. And I think it's a perfect time, even though you felt like it was rushed. And you said you were doing the audiobook 6 hours a day, which sounds
Yes.
insane. We're really happy to have it right now because this is a perfect time to launch a book and to have these kind of stories from Japan.
Well, that's so nice of you to say. Thank you.
So we just have 2 more minutes.
Okay.
I would
Gonna really
love,
make these count. Okay.
yeah, I would love for you to introduce the yokai article about coronavirus.
Oh, Amabie. So
Yes.
Amabie is a Japanese yokai, and a yokai is a basically creature from Japanese folklore. And we use the word yokai because the English word monster or demon has so much baggage that yokai doesn't. It's kind of like kawaii in that way. We kind of like to use the word as it is. But Amabie is a yokai that appeared off the coast of Kyushu in the 1800s and gave a prophecy, it is said, that if a plague should come, show my visage to the people. And then she disappeared. And somebody rediscovered this prophecy at the beginning of the coronavirus era, and on Twitter posted their own illustration of Amabie, and this went positively viral in the internet meme sense during the era of real viral going out in the real world. And Amabie has become the kind of mascot character of surviving in the COVID-19 era. And she's this very strange looking creature with a kind of triple mermaid legs, a bird's beak, and long hair. And she's great in so many ways. Number one, she's just this kind of wild looking creature, but that she's almost inviting you to draw her is a perfect fit for the kind of meme-y viral era, and share her. She's a literal viral meme from the 1800s. And it is so amazing to me that she emerged back then and went kind of into hibernation for over 100 years, only to be rediscovered now. And that's another perfect example of things that might be buried and hidden in our past that are tools to help us navigate in the future. So she's sustainability personified.
Yeah, for sure. And she's warning us to take climate change seriously, to take coronavirus pandemic seriously. Like, she's a wonderful sustainability yokai.
And a mascot, and she's there with us. She's like cheering alongside of us, and I think that's also really important to remember. There's always somebody on your side, even if she happens to be a yokai.
Yeah, for sure. So that's a great place to end. I would love to send people to your website and your articles on the New Yorker,
please,
about the yokai, as well as your new book. So you have all of your links to articles as well as book links. You can buy the book on audio as well.
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah?
Yes.
And digital version and paper version.
Yes, wherever books are sold. So please support your local bookstore, support your local library. The book is out there. And by all means, please pick it up and feel free to get in touch with me anytime.
Thank you so much. And we had some wonderful comments along the way.
Really?
No questions, so I just kept putting the comments up there. Thank you, everybody, for commenting. And thank you for joining us. Everybody have a great weekend. Thank you so much, Matt.
Take
you.
Care. Thanks for having me.